What happens when the weapon everyone laughs at becomes the instrument of their salvation? When the old man they dismiss as harmless transforms into their greatest protector? This is the story of Ezekiel, a man whose useless rifle would write one of the most incredible chapters of resistance ever witnessed. If you love stories of courage against impossible odds, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this tale will leave you speechless. The morning mist clung to the cotton fields of the Riverside Plantation like a shroud, and through it walked a figure that most had learned to overlook. Ezekiel moved with the careful, measured steps of a man who had survived 63 years in a world that had never intended for him to see 30. His weathered hands gripped a rifle that seemed almost as old as he was, a weapon that had become the subject of countless jokes among both the enslaved and their overseers. The plantation itself sprawled across nearly 2,000 acres of Mississippi Delta land, its main house a testament to wealth built on the backs of human suffering. White columns rose like monuments to hypocrisy, supporting a grand portico where the master, Colonel Whitmore, would sit in the evenings, sipping bourbon while counting the profits of human misery. The slave quarters, by contrast, were a collection of ramshackle cabins that leaked in winter and baked like ovens in summer, housing nearly 300 souls who had been reduced to property in the ledgers of commerce. Ezekiel's cabin sat slightly apart from the others, a privilege earned through decades of what the overseers considered reliable service. What they didn't know was that this isolation had been carefully cultivated, providing him with the privacy he needed for activities that would have earned him a death sentence if discovered. The cabin's walls were lined with carefully hidden compartments containing maps of escape routes, coded messages from the Underground Railroad, and most importantly, the tools of his true trade. "There goes old Ezekiel with his museum piece," laughed Samuel, one of the younger field hands, as he watched the elderly man make his way toward the tool shed. Samuel was barely 20, born into slavery and raised to believe that resistance was futile. His laughter carried the bitter edge of a man who had never known hope. "That rifle's so old it probably belonged to George Washington himself." The laughter rippled through the group of men taking their brief morning break. Even Marcus, usually more respectful of his elders, couldn't help but smile. Marcus was different from the others, intelligent, observant, and possessed of a quiet dignity that had somehow survived the systematic dehumanization of plantation life. "Ezekiel, when you gonna get yourself a real gun? That thing looks like it'll fall apart if you sneeze on it." The other men joined in the mockery, their voices carrying across the morning air. There was James, a massive man whose strength had made him valuable in the fields, but whose gentle nature had made him a target for the overseer's cruelty. There was Peter, quick-witted and fast-talking, who used humor as a shield against the daily humiliations of their existence. And there was old Moses, whose white hair and bent back told the story of 50 years under the lash, but whose eyes still burned with an unquenchable fire. Ezekiel paused, his dark eyes meeting Marcus's with a patience that spoke of decades of such comments. The rifle in his hands was indeed old, its wooden stock worn smooth by countless hands, its metal barrel bearing the patina of age and use. Rust spots dotted its surface like freckles, and the trigger guard had been repaired more than once with wire and determination. But those who looked closely might have noticed that despite its aged appearance, every component was meticulously maintained. The bore was clean and bright, the action smooth and precise, the sights carefully aligned. "This rifle," Ezekiel said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years, "belonged to my father, and his father before him. It may not look like much, but it's never failed me when it mattered." The weapon was a masterpiece of early American gunsmithing, crafted in the Pennsylvania Dutch country by artisans who understood that a man's life might depend on the accuracy of his shot. Its 50 caliber bore was designed to deliver devastating power at extreme range, while its octagonal barrel provided the rigidity necessary for precision shooting. The stock was carved from seasoned maple, its grain carefully selected for strength and stability. Every detail, from the hand-forged trigger to the precisely cut rifling, spoke of a time when weapons were built to last generations. "When has it ever mattered?" Samuel pressed, emboldened by the chuckles of his companions. "You use it to hunt rabbits and possums, Not exactly what I'd call dangerous work. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Ezekiel's rabbit hunting had fed more runaway slaves than any of them could imagine, that his possum shooting had eliminated more than one slave catcher who had gotten too close to the underground routes that snaked through the bayous and forests surrounding the plantation. The old rifle had spoken death to those who would drag free souls back to chains, but Ezekiel had never spoken of it. In the pre-dawn hours, when the plantation slept and the overseers were drunk on whiskey and power, Ezekiel would slip away into the swamplands that bordered the property. There, hidden among the cypress trees and Spanish moss, he would meet with conductors on the Underground Railroad, providing them with intelligence about patrol routes, safe houses, and the movements of slave catchers. His rifle had protected more than one group of freedom seekers, its voice echoing through the night, like the judgment of an angry god. The overseer, a cruel man named Hutchins, rode up on his horse just as the laughter was dying down. Hutchins was a product of the worst aspects of the plantation system, a poor white man who had been given just enough power to make him dangerous and just enough hatred to make him cruel. His pale eyes swept over the group with the casual malice of a man who enjoyed his power over others, his hand resting on the whip that hung from his saddle. "What's all this noise about? You boys got time to stand around jawing. Maybe you got too much free time." Hutchins' horse was a fine mare, better fed and better cared for than any of the human beings under his authority. The irony was not lost on the men who stood before him, their own bodies bearing the scars of his casual violence. The overseer's face was flushed with the perpetual redness of a man who drank too much and thought too little, his small eyes darting constantly as if looking for an excuse to inflict pain. "Just admiring Ezekiel's antique, sir," Samuel said, the humor draining from his voice as it always did when Hutchins appeared. The transformation was immediate and complete. The laughing young man disappeared, replaced by the careful mask of subservience that was necessary for survival. Hutchins's gaze fell on the rifle, and his lips curled into a sneer. "That piece of junk? Hell, I wouldn't trust that thing to kill a sick chicken. Ezekiel, why don't you just throw that rust bucket away and get yourself a proper weapon?" "Oh, wait," he laughed at his own joke. "Slaves don't get proper weapons, do they?" The silence that followed was thick with tension. Ezekiel's grip on the rifle tightened almost imperceptibly, but his expression remained neutral. He had learned long ago that showing emotion to men like Hutchins was like showing blood to sharks. The overseer's words carried the casual cruelty of a system that reduced human beings to property, but they also revealed something else, a fundamental misunderstanding of what made a weapon truly dangerous. "Yes, sir," Ezekiel replied simply, "just an old tool for old work." But even as he spoke the words of submission, Ezekiel's mind was calculating. He noted the distance to Hutchins, approximately 15 yards, an easy shot even with a smoothbore musket. He observed the overseer's position on his horse, the way he sat carelessly in the saddle, confident in his authority and blind to the danger that stood before him. Most importantly, he noted the other men watching, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes burning with the accumulated rage of lifetimes spent in bondage. Hutchins spurred his horse and rode off, but not before adding, "Make sure that old work includes fixing the fence in the north pasture. And Ezekiel, try not to shoot yourself with that relic." As the overseer disappeared into the morning haze, the group of men dispersed to their various tasks. The cotton fields stretched endlessly in all directions, white bowls ready for harvest under a sun that would soon become merciless. The work was backbreaking, designed to extract maximum profit from human labor, while providing just enough sustenance to keep the workers alive. It was a system of calculated cruelty, refined over generations to break spirits while preserving bodies. But Marcus lingered, studying Ezekiel's face with the intuition of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs that meant survival. There was something in the old man's eyes, a depth that spoke of experiences far beyond the boundaries of the plantation. Marcus had always sensed that Ezekiel was different from the others, but he had never been able to put his finger on exactly how. "There's more to that rifle than you let on, isn't there?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ezekiel looked at the younger man for a long moment. Marcus was smart, reliable, and most importantly, he could keep his mouth shut. In the dangerous game of resistance that Ezekiel had been playing for decades, the ability to judge character was often the difference between life and death. He saw in Marcus's eyes the spark of something that the plantation system had tried to extinguish, the recognition that human beings were meant to be free. Every tool has its purpose, Marcus. Some purposes just aren't meant for public discussion. Before Marcus could ask what he meant, a commotion erupted from the direction of the main house. Shouts and the thunder of hoofbeats filled the air as a rider came galloping up the plantation road, his horse lathered with sweat and his face wild with panic. The rider was a free black man named Thomas, who worked as a blacksmith in the nearby town of Millbrook, his status as a freeman making him valuable as a messenger and go-between for the Underground Railroad. "Slave catchers!" the rider yelled as he pulled up near the main house. "Professional hunters! They got Thompson's place yesterday. Killed 3, captured 5. They're heading this way." The blood drained from Marcus's face. Everyone knew about the Thompson plantation. It was only 15 miles south, a smaller operation that had been known for its relatively humane treatment of enslaved people. If professional slave catchers were working the area, it meant someone with serious money had hired them. These weren't the usual local bounty hunters who might be bought off or reasoned with. These were killers who treated human hunting like a sport, men who had turned the recapture of freedom seekers into a profitable business. The news spread through the plantation like wildfire. In the fields, workers stopped their labor to whisper among themselves. In the quarters, mothers pulled their children close and began making plans for hiding places. The very air seemed to thicken with fear, the kind of terror that came from knowing that death was riding toward them on horseback. Ezekiel's weathered hands tightened on his rifle, and for just a moment, Marcus caught a glimpse of something in the old man's eyes that made him take a step back. It wasn't fear. It was the cold, calculating look of a predator who had just caught the scent of prey. The transformation was subtle but complete, as if a mask had been removed to reveal the true nature of the man beneath. "Marcus," Ezekiel said quietly, his voice carrying a new edge that seemed to cut through the morning air like a blade. "I think it's time you learned what this old rifle can really do." The morning mist was beginning to burn off, but a different kind of fog was rolling in, the fog of war. And in the hands of a man everyone had dismissed as harmless, an antique rifle was about to remind the world that some weapons become more dangerous with age, not less. As the plantation erupted into panicked activity, Ezekiel walked calmly toward his small cabin, his mind already calculating distances, wind patterns, and the 100 small details that separated a good shot from a dead one. The slave catchers were coming, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had no idea who was waiting for them. The slave catchers arrived at dawn on the second day, and they came like a plague of locusts. 12 men on horseback armed with the latest rifles and revolvers, their faces bearing the hard lines of those who had made killing their profession. They were led by a man called Deadeye Morrison, whose reputation for never missing a shot had made him the most feared hunter in 3 states. Morrison was a tall, lean man with pale eyes that seemed to look right through a person. His rifle was a brand new Spencer repeating rifle, capable of firing 7 shots without reloading, a weapon that represented the cutting edge of 1863 technology. The Spencer was a marvel of modern engineering, its tubular magazine allowing for rapid fire that could devastate enemy formations. It was the kind of weapon that had changed the nature of warfare itself, turning individual soldiers into one-man armies. Behind Morrison rode his lieutenant, a scarred man named Briggs, whose face told the story of a dozen violent encounters. Briggs carried a pair of Colt Navy revolvers, their ivory grips worn smooth by constant use. The rest of the hunting party was equally well armed, each man carrying multiple weapons and enough ammunition to fight a small war. They were professionals in the truest sense, men who had turned violence into a science and death into a profitable enterprise. The hunting party had spent the previous evening studying maps of the plantation, planning their approach with military precision. They knew the layout of the buildings, the location of the slave quarters, and the most likely escape routes. Morrison had built his reputation on meticulous preparation, never leaving anything to chance. He had studied the reports from Thompson's plantation, noting the efficiency with which the operation had been conducted. 3 dead, 5 captured, no casualties among his men. It was the kind of clean, profitable work that had made him wealthy. "Spread out," Morrison commanded as they approached the plantation, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Standard sweep pattern. Remember, we're being paid for live captures, but dead ones send a message too. Don't hesitate to make examples." The hunting party deployed with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated like the parts of a well-oiled machine. Morrison had developed his tactics during years of hunting both animals and men, understanding that the psychology of fear was often more effective than brute force. A few well-placed killings would terrorize the rest into submission, making the capture of the survivors that much easier. What Morrison didn't know was that he was already being watched. From a position nearly 400 yards away, hidden in a grove of oak trees that overlooked the plantation's main approach, Ezekiel lay prone behind his ancient rifle. The weapon that everyone mocked was now revealed in its true element, a precision instrument that had been crafted by a master gunsmith in Pennsylvania over 50 years ago. The grove provided perfect concealment, its massive trees draped with Spanish moss that filtered the morning light into a dappled pattern of shadows and sunbeams. Ezekiel had chosen this position carefully, studying the approaches to the plantation for years and identifying the best vantage points for defensive fire. The ground beneath him was soft with decades of fallen leaves, providing a stable shooting platform that would absorb the recoil of his heavy rifle. The rifle was a .50 caliber long gun, built for accuracy at extreme range. Its octagonal barrel was longer than most modern weapons, designed in an era when a single shot had to count. The wooden stock, worn smooth by decades of use, fit Ezekiel's shoulder like it had been carved specifically for him. Because, in a way it had been, 3 generations of the same family had learned its quirks, its tendencies, its personality. The weapon's sights were simple but effective, a blade front sight and a notched rear sight that had been carefully adjusted over the years to compensate for the rifle's unique characteristics. Ezekiel knew exactly how the rifle would behave in different weather conditions, how the wind would affect the heavy .50 caliber ball, and how to compensate for the slight tendency of the barrel to throw shots to the left at extreme range. Through the crude but effective iron sights, Ezekiel watched the slave catchers deploy. His breathing was slow and controlled, his heartbeat steady. This was not the first time he had faced professional killers, though it had been many years since the last time. During his youth, when the Underground Railroad was just beginning to take shape, he had served as what they called a conductor's guardian, the man who eliminated threats to the freedom routes. The memories came flooding back as he watched Morrison's men spread out across the plantation grounds. He remembered a night in Tennessee when he had faced down 3 bounty hunters who had cornered a family of runaways. He recalled a dawn in Alabama when his rifle had spoken death to a slave catcher who had been torturing captured freedom seekers. Each shot had been a small victory in a war that most people didn't even know was being fought. Marcus crouched beside him, his own hands shaking as he gripped an old shotgun. The young man's face was pale with fear, but his eyes burned with determination. He had volunteered to serve as Ezekiel's spotter, despite having no experience in combat. "Ezekiel, there's 12 of them. 12 professional killers with modern weapons. How can we possibly—" "Quiet," Ezekiel whispered, his eye never leaving the sight picture. "Watch and learn." The old marksman's voice carried a calm authority that seemed to steady Marcus's nerves. There was something almost supernatural about Ezekiel's composure, as if the approaching danger had awakened something deep within him that had been sleeping for years. His weathered hands were rock steady on the rifle, his breathing so controlled that it seemed he might not be breathing at all. Morrison had dismounted and was studying the plantation layout through a spyglass, his pale eyes scanning the buildings for signs of resistance. He was approximately 380 yards away, a difficult shot for most weapons of the era, but well within the capabilities of Ezekiel's rifle. The old man had spent decades learning to judge wind, distance, and the dozen other factors that affected a long-range shot. The morning air was still, with just a slight breeze from the southeast. Ezekiel adjusted his aim fractionally to compensate, his finger finding the familiar curve of the trigger. The rifle's mechanism was old, but perfectly maintained. Ezekiel had spent countless hours cleaning and caring for every component, understanding that his life and the lives of others might depend on the weapon's reliability. Morrison lowered his spyglass and turned to give orders to his men. It was the moment Ezekiel had been waiting for. The target was stationary, presenting his full profile. The slave catcher's arrogance was evident in his casual posture, his complete confidence that he faced no real threat from the plantation's inhabitants. The ancient rifle spoke with a voice like thunder. The .50 caliber ball, propelled by a carefully measured charge of black powder, crossed the distance in less than a second. Morrison's spyglass exploded in his hands as the heavy lead projectile took him in the center of his chest, lifting him off his feet and dropping him like a stone. The impact was devastating, the massive bullet tearing through bone and tissue with the force of a sledgehammer. For a moment, the remaining 11 hunters sat frozen in their saddles, unable to process what had just happened. Their legendary leader, the man who had never missed a shot, was dead before he hit the ground, and the shot had come from so far away that they couldn't even see the smoke. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. These men who had built their reputations on inspiring fear in others suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of terror. "Sniper!" Briggs screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "Take cover!" The disciplined formation immediately dissolved into chaos as the hunters dove for whatever cover they could find. Some threw themselves behind water troughs, others sought shelter behind buildings, and a few simply lay flat on the ground, hoping that invisibility might save them from the invisible marksman who had just demonstrated his deadly accuracy. But Ezekiel was already reloading with the smooth efficiency of long practice. Powder, wadding, ball, ramrod, movements so automatic they seemed like breathing. The entire process took him less than 30 seconds, a speed that would have impressed even modern soldiers. His hands moved with the precision of a craftsman, each motion economical and purposeful. Marcus watched in amazement as the old man worked, his fear temporarily forgotten in the face of such professional competence. "How did you make that shot? The distance, the wind?" 50 years of practice," Ezekiel replied quietly, his eye already back on the sights. "And a rifle that was built by men who understood that accuracy was more important than speed." Briggs was trying to rally his men, pointing in the general direction of Ezekiel's position. The lieutenant was a veteran of numerous hunting expeditions, but he had never faced anything like this. His men were scattered and demoralized, their confidence shattered by the sudden death of their leader. He made the mistake of standing in his stirrups to get a better view, presenting a clear target against the morning sky. The second shot took Briggs in the throat, spinning him from his saddle like a rag doll. The heavy bullet nearly decapitated him, sending a spray of blood across the plantation yard that painted the morning air crimson. His horse reared and bolted, dragging the lifeless body for several yards before the foot came free from the stirrup. Now the remaining 10 hunters were in full panic. They had expected to be hunting frightened, unarmed slaves. Instead, they found themselves being picked off by an invisible marksman with impossible accuracy. Their modern weapons were useless at this range, and they had no idea where the shots were coming from. The tables had been turned completely. The hunters had become the hunted. "Spread out!" one of them yelled, his voice high with panic. "Find that shooter!" But spreading out only made them easier targets. Ezekiel's third shot dropped a hunter who was trying to flank around the plantation house, the bullet taking him in the back as he ran for cover. His fourth took down a man who thought he was safely hidden behind a water trough, the heavy projectile punching through the wooden barrier as if it were paper. The remaining hunters were now completely demoralized. They had come to the plantation expecting an easy hunt, but instead found themselves facing a marksman whose skill bordered on the supernatural. Some began to retreat toward the tree line, while others simply cowered behind whatever cover they could find, paralyzed by fear. Marcus watched in amazement as the old man worked with mechanical precision. There was no emotion in Ezekiel's face, no satisfaction or anger, just the cold focus of a craftsman perfecting his art. Each shot was deliberate and calculated, the result of decades of experience and an intimate knowledge of his weapon's capabilities. "How?" Marcus whispered. "How are you making these shots?" "This rifle," Ezekiel said as he reloaded again, his movements never pausing, was built by a man named Jacob Dickert in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. He made weapons for men who needed to hit what they aimed at every time. My grandfather bought it from him in 1810, and it's been in our family ever since. The fifth shot shattered the spine of a hunter who thought he was safely concealed behind a barn. The sixth took down a man who was trying to retreat to the tree line, the bullet catching him in mid-stride and sending him tumbling into the cotton rows. By now, the remaining hunters were in complete disarray. Half their number was dead or dying, and they still hadn't even seen their attacker. The psychological effect was devastating. These were men who were used to being the predators, not the prey. Their entire worldview had been shattered in the space of a few minutes. "We need to get out of here," one of them screamed, his voice breaking with terror. "This ain't natural. No man can shoot like that." But Ezekiel wasn't finished. His seventh shot dropped a hunter who was trying to mount his horse, the bullet taking the man in the chest just as he swung his leg over the saddle. His eighth caught a man who thought he could escape by crawling through the cotton rows, the heavy projectile finding him despite his attempts at concealment. As the sun climbed higher, painting the plantation in shades of gold and red, 8 of the 12 slave catchers lay dead. The remaining 4 had finally managed to retreat beyond the range of Ezekiel's rifle, but they were broken men, their confidence shattered like glass. They huddled in the tree line, their faces pale with shock and the terrible realization that they had encountered something beyond their understanding. Marcus stared at the carnage below, then at the old man beside him. The transformation was complete. The harmless old slave with the rusty rifle had revealed himself to be something far more dangerous. "Ezekiel, who are you really?" The old man's weathered hands were already cleaning his rifle, preparing it for whatever came next. The weapon that had seemed so antiquated just hours before now appeared to glow with an inner fire, its every surface speaking of deadly competence. "I'm exactly who I've always been, Marcus. The difference is now you know what that means." In the distance, the 4 surviving hunters were regrouping, their faces pale with shock and fear. They had come to the plantation as predators, but they were leaving as prey. And somewhere in the back of their minds, they knew this wasn't over. Word of what had happened here would spread, and with it would come reinforcements, more hunters better armed and better prepared. The old rifle had spoken, and its voice carried a message that would echo through the region for years to come. The hunters had become the hunted, and the weapon everyone mocked had just rewritten the rules of the game. As Ezekiel and Marcus made their way back toward the plantation, the old man's eyes were already scanning the horizon. 4 hunters remained, and he knew they would be back, probably with reinforcements. The battle was far from over, but the first round had gone to the defenders. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Today, the useless rifle had reminded the world that some weapons, like some men, only grew more dangerous with age. Word of the massacre spread through the region like wildfire. By evening, riders were carrying the news to every plantation, every town, every crossroads within 50 miles. The legendary Deadeye Morrison and 7 of his best hunters had been killed by a single marksman using what witnesses described as an ancient rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum. The news traveled through the complex network of communication that existed in the antebellum South, a mixture of official channels and underground whispers that carried information faster than any telegraph. In the slave quarters of distant plantations, the story was told in hushed tones around cooking fires, each telling adding new details and embellishments. In the parlors of great houses, plantation owners gathered to discuss the implications of what had happened at Riverside, their voices tight with concern and barely concealed fear. The 4 surviving hunters had made it to the town of Millbrook, where they sat in the saloon, their hands shaking as they tried to drink away the memory of watching their companions die one by one. The local sheriff, a man named Crawford who supplemented his income by helping slave catchers, listened to their story with growing disbelief. Crawford was a product of the corrupt system that governed much of the rural South, a man who had learned to profit from the misery of others while maintaining a veneer of respectability. "You're telling me," Crawford said slowly, his voice heavy with skepticism, "that one old slave with a rusty rifle killed 8 professional hunters, 8 men with modern weapons. Kellerman, who had assumed leadership of the surviving hunters, nodded grimly. His face was still pale with shock, his eyes haunted by the memory of watching his companions fall one by one to an invisible marksman. "I saw Morrison die, Sheriff. Saw his chest explode from a shot that came from so far away we couldn't even see the smoke. That wasn't luck. That was skill like I've never seen." The saloon had fallen silent as other patrons strained to hear the conversation. Word of Morrison's death would send shockwaves through the entire slave-catching industry. The man had been a legend, and if he could be killed by a single marksman, it meant the rules of the game had changed fundamentally. The psychological impact was enormous. If Deadeye Morrison could be killed, then no one was safe. Crawford leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the implications. Morrison's death would create a power vacuum in the slave-catching business, but it would also inspire others to take up arms against the hunters. The story would spread, and with it would come a new kind of resistance, organized, deadly, and led by men who understood that freedom was worth killing for. "We need reinforcements," Kellerman continued, his voice shaking slightly. "Professional soldiers, maybe. Men who know how to fight a real war. Or," Crawford said thoughtfully, his eyes narrowing as he considered the possibilities, "we need to be smarter about this. One man, no matter how good, can't be everywhere at once. We find his weaknesses, exploit them, turn his own people against him." Meanwhile, back at the plantation, Ezekiel was preparing for the next phase of what he knew would be a prolonged battle. The slave quarters buzzed with whispered conversations as word of the day's events spread like wildfire through the community. Some of the enslaved people looked at Ezekiel with new respect, others with fear. A few, like Marcus, looked at him with something approaching awe. The transformation in the community was palpable. For the first time in their lives, many of the enslaved people had seen their oppressors defeated, had witnessed the impossible become reality. The psychological chains that had bound them for generations were beginning to crack, replaced by something that had been absent for so long they had almost forgotten its name. Hope. "They'll be back," Ezekiel said quietly as he sat on the steps of his cabin, methodically cleaning his rifle. The weapon lay across his knees like a sleeping serpent, its every surface gleaming with the care of a master craftsman. "And they'll be smarter about it next time." Sarah, an elderly woman who had known Ezekiel for decades, approached with a bowl of stew. Her weathered face bore the lines of 60 years of hard labor, but her eyes held a spark that hadn't been there that morning. "Ezekiel, what you did today, it's going to bring trouble down on all of us." "The trouble was already coming, Sarah," he replied, accepting the food gratefully. "I just made sure it arrived on our terms instead of theirs." The stew was simple fare, cornmeal and vegetables with a few scraps of meat, but it tasted like victory to Ezekiel. For the first time in years, he was eating as a free man, not as property. The difference was subtle but profound, a shift in perspective that changed everything. Marcus sat down beside him, still trying to process what he had witnessed. The young man's worldview had been shattered and rebuilt in the space of a few hours, and he was struggling to understand the implications of what had happened. "You said this rifle belonged to your grandfather. Was he like you?" Ezekiel's weathered hands paused in their cleaning motion. For a moment his eyes seemed to look back across the decades, seeing faces and places that existed now only in memory. The weight of 3 generations of struggle pressed down on him, but it was a burden he carried with pride. "My grandfather's name was Joshua," he said finally, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. "He was born free in Pennsylvania, but he came south during the early days of the Underground Railroad. He believed that freedom wasn't something you waited for. It was something you fought for." The old man's voice carried across the small group that had gathered around him, drawing them into a story that few had ever heard. In the slave quarters, stories were precious things passed down through generations like family heirlooms. But this story was different. It was a tale of resistance, of men who had refused to accept the chains that society had tried to place on them. Joshua carried this rifle through battles that history never recorded. He fought slave catchers in the swamps of Georgia, helped establish safe houses in Tennessee, and taught other free men how to shoot straight when it mattered. When he died, he passed the rifle to my father, along with the knowledge of how to use it. The rifle itself seemed to glow in the firelight, its weathered surfaces telling their own story of decades of careful use. Every scratch, every worn spot, every carefully repaired component spoke of a weapon that had been more than just a tool. It had been a symbol of resistance, a tangible connection to the dream of freedom. "And your father?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father was captured when I was 15, Ezekiel said, his voice hardening with old pain. "Sold south to a plantation in Mississippi. But before they took him, he made sure I knew everything Joshua had taught him. How to read the wind, how to judge distance, how to make every shot count." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of shared suffering. Every person in the group had lost family members to the slave trade, had watched loved ones disappear into the vast machinery of human bondage. But Ezekiel's story offered something different. The possibility that those losses could be avenged, that the system that had destroyed so many lives could be fought and defeated. Sarah shook her head sadly, but there was admiration in her eyes. "All these years we thought you were just a harmless old man who liked to hunt." "I was never harmless," Ezekiel corrected gently. "I was just careful. There's a difference." The distinction was important, and everyone present understood it. In a world where the slightest sign of resistance could mean death, survival often depended on the ability to hide one's true nature. Ezekiel had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing harmless while remaining deadly, a skill that had kept him alive and allowed him to help others find freedom. As if to emphasize his point, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the night air. But these weren't the measured steps of slave catchers. These were the frantic gallops of messengers bringing urgent news. The sound sent a ripple of tension through the gathered group, but Ezekiel remained calm, his hands never pausing in their work on the rifle. 3 riders burst into the plantation yard, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with urgency. The lead rider was Thomas, the blacksmith from Millbrook, whose status as a free man allowed him to move between communities and carry messages. His face was tight with concern as he dismounted, his eyes immediately seeking out Ezekiel. "Ezekiel!" he called out, his voice carrying across the night air. "They're coming back, and they're bringing an army!" The old marksman rose slowly, his rifle cradled in his arms like a sleeping child. The weapon that had seemed so antiquated just days before now appeared to pulse with deadly energy, its every surface speaking of lethal competence. How many? 20 men, maybe more. Professional soldiers, not just bounty hunters. They're camped 5 miles south, planning to attack at dawn. Thomas's voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. "Crawford's put a bounty on your head. $500, dead or alive. Words already spreading to every hunter in 3 states. A murmur of fear rippled through the gathered slaves. 20 professional soldiers against 1 old man with an ancient rifle. The odds seemed impossible. But Ezekiel's expression remained calm, his mind already calculating the tactical situation. He had faced worse odds before, though not for many years. "Thomas, I need you to ride to the Johnson plantation, then to the Williams place. Tell them what's happening here. Tell them it's time to choose sides." Ezekiel's voice carried a new authority, the tone of a man who had stepped fully into his role as a leader of resistance. "What about us?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with fear and anticipation. "What do we do?" Ezekiel looked around at the faces surrounding him, men and women who had lived their entire lives under the boot of oppression, who had never dared to dream that they might fight back and win. But something had changed in their eyes, a spark of defiance that hadn't been there that morning. "We do what my grandfather did," he said simply, his voice carrying across the night air like a promise. "We make them pay for every inch of ground. We show them that some things are worth dying for, and some people are worth killing for." He turned to Marcus, studying the young man's face in the firelight. "Can you shoot?" "Some," Marcus replied, though his voice shook slightly with the weight of what was being asked of him. "Then you'll be my spotter. Sarah, I need you to organize the others. Anyone who can't fight needs to be ready to run if things go badly. Anyone who can fight." He paused, looking around the group with eyes that seemed to see into their very souls. "Anyone who can fight gets to help write a new chapter in our story." As the night deepened, Ezekiel began preparing for what he knew would be the fight of his life. He cleaned his rifle one more time, checked his powder supply, and counted his lead balls. He had enough ammunition for perhaps 30 shots, and against 20 professional soldiers, it would have to be enough. But as he worked, other figures began emerging from the darkness. Men from neighboring plantations, some carrying old hunting rifles, others armed with nothing more than farm tools and determination. Word was spreading through the underground network that connected the enslaved communities, and for the first time in decades, people were choosing to stand and fight rather than run and hide. By midnight, nearly 40 men had gathered around Ezekiel's cabin. They weren't soldiers, and their weapons were a motley collection of ancient firearms and improvised weapons. But they had something the professional hunters lacked. They were fighting for their freedom, their families, their very right to exist as human beings. Ezekiel looked out at the faces surrounding him, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to smile. The expression transformed his weathered features, revealing the man he might have been in a different world, a better time. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the night air like a benediction, "tomorrow we're going to teach some professional killers what it means to fight people who have nothing left to lose." The ancient rifle gleamed in the moonlight, and somewhere in the distance, 20 professional soldiers were about to discover that some weapons, and some men, become legends for a reason. Dawn was coming, and with it, the battle that would determine whether the name Ezekiel would be remembered as a footnote in history, or as the man who proved that freedom was always worth fighting for. Dawn broke grey and cold over the plantation, with a mist that clung to the ground like the breath of ghosts. 20 professional soldiers, led by a former Confederate officer named Colonel Hayes, approached through the cotton fields in a disciplined formation that spoke of real military training. These weren't bounty hunters or slave catchers. These were men who had learned their trade in the killing fields of the Civil War, veterans of battles like Antietam and Gettysburg, where death had been measured in thousands rather than dozens. Colonel Hayes was a methodical man who had studied the previous day's massacre with the cold analysis of a professional soldier. His weathered face bore the scars of Shiloh, where Confederate grapeshot had nearly taken his life, and his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen too much death. He had concluded that they were facing a single marksman of exceptional skill, probably positioned in the same grove of oak trees where the earlier shots had originated. His plan was simple: a frontal assault to draw the sniper's fire, while flanking forces moved in from both sides to eliminate him. The soldiers under Hayes's command were a mixture of former Confederate and Union veterans, men who had put aside their political differences in favor of the profitable business of hunting human beings. They carried the latest military weapons, Spencer repeating rifles, Colt revolvers, and even a few experimental breech-loading rifles that represented the cutting edge of firearms technology. Their uniforms were a patchwork of military surplus and civilian clothing, but their bearing was unmistakably professional. What Hayes didn't know was that Ezekiel had anticipated exactly this strategy. The old marksman had spent the night studying the terrain, identifying every possible approach route, and calculating fields of fire with the precision of an engineer. He understood that his previous position in the oak grove would be the obvious target for any competent military commander, which was exactly why he had abandoned it. The old marksman was no longer in the oak grove. Instead, he had positioned himself in the bell tower of the plantation's small chapel, a vantage point that gave him a commanding view of the entire approach. The chapel was a modest structure, built more for the spiritual comfort of the plantation's white family than for any military purpose, but its tower provided an excellent shooting position. His ancient rifle rested on a makeshift shooting rest constructed from prayer books and hymnals, its barrel trained on the advancing soldiers. The irony was not lost on Ezekiel. He was about to deliver divine judgment from a house of worship, using a weapon that had been blessed by 3 generations of righteous anger. The chapel's windows had been carefully modified during the night, with wooden shutters that could be opened and closed quickly, to provide both concealment and protection. But Ezekiel was not alone. Marcus crouched beside him with a spyglass liberated from the plantation house, calling out ranges and wind conditions with the precision of a trained artillery spotter. Below, scattered throughout the plantation buildings, nearly 40 armed men waited in carefully prepared positions. They had spent the night turning the plantation into a fortress, using their intimate knowledge of every building, every fence, every hiding place to create a defensive network that would have impressed professional military engineers. The transformation of the plantation was remarkable. What had been a symbol of oppression, just days before had become a fortress of resistance. Barricades had been constructed from cotton bales and farm equipment, firing positions had been carved into the walls of buildings, and escape routes had been prepared for those who couldn't fight. The enslaved community had become an army, united by a common purpose that transcended their individual fears. "Range 400 yards, Marcus whispered, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were facing. "Lead element, moving in column formation." Ezekiel's weathered finger found the trigger of his rifle. At this distance, with the morning mist and the movement of the targets, it would be a difficult shot. But the old weapon had never failed him when it mattered most, and he had spent decades learning to compensate for every variable that could affect a long-range shot. The soldiers advanced with the confidence of professionals, their formation tight and disciplined. Hayes rode at their head, his own rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning the plantation buildings for signs of resistance. He had fought in dozens of battles during the war, and he approached this engagement with the same methodical precision that had kept him alive through 4 years of carnage. The rifle's thunder split the morning air like the voice of an angry god, and Colonel Hayes's sergeant spun to the ground, his chest shattered by the heavy .50 caliber ball. The disciplined advance immediately dissolved into chaos as the soldiers dove for cover, their careful formation scattered by the psychological impact of watching their leader fall to an invisible marksman. The effect was immediate and devastating. These were veteran soldiers who had faced artillery barrages and cavalry charges, but there was something uniquely terrifying about being picked off by an unseen sniper. The shot had come from an impossible distance, delivered with surgical precision that spoke of skill beyond anything they had encountered. "There!" Hayes shouted, pointing toward the chapel tower with his saber. "Concentrate fire on that position." A volley of rifle fire erupted from the soldiers' modern Spencer repeating rifles, but their shots fell short. The chapel tower was over 500 yards away, beyond the effective range of their weapons, but well within the capabilities of Ezekiel's long rifle. The old weapon had been designed for exactly this kind of engagement, built in an era when battles were fought at distances that modern soldiers could barely comprehend. The old marksman was already reloading with the smooth efficiency of decades of practice. Powder, wadding, ball, ramrod, 30 seconds of mechanical precision while bullets whistled harmlessly overhead. His movements were so automatic that he could perform them in complete darkness, each motion refined by years of repetition until it had become as natural as breathing. His second shot took down a soldier who was trying to set up a more accurate firing position behind a water trough. The heavy bullet punched through the wooden barrier and the man behind it with equal ease, demonstrating the devastating power of the old rifle. His third dropped a man who thought he was safely concealed behind a pile of cotton bales, the projectile tearing through the soft material as if it weren't there. But Hayes was a veteran of real warfare, and he quickly adapted to the situation. He had faced snipers before during the siege of Petersburg, and he understood that the key to defeating a marksman was to deny him clear fields of fire while closing the distance to effective range. "Flanking parties, move out. Keep that sniper busy while we get into effective range." 2 groups of soldiers began moving around the plantation's perimeter, using buildings and terrain features for cover. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had learned their trade in the crucible of war, their movements coordinated and purposeful. It was exactly what Ezekiel had been waiting for. The old marksman had spent the night preparing for this moment, positioning his allies in carefully chosen locations that would turn the plantation into a killing field. He had studied the tactics of military commanders like Nathan Bedford Forrest and John Singleton Mosby, learning how small forces could defeat larger ones through superior positioning and local knowledge. "Now," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. The signal was passed from building to building through a network of hand signals and whispered commands, and suddenly the plantation erupted in gunfire. The hidden defenders opened up from a dozen different positions, their old hunting rifles and shotguns speaking with voices of thunder and flame. The flanking soldiers found themselves caught in a crossfire, facing not one sniper, but an entire army of determined men fighting for their freedom. The battle that followed was unlike anything the professional soldiers had ever experienced. They were used to fighting other soldiers, men who followed the conventional rules of warfare and moved in predictable patterns. But the defenders of the plantation fought with the desperate creativity of people who had nothing left to lose, using every advantage that their intimate knowledge of the terrain could provide. Samuel, the young man who had mocked Ezekiel's rifle just days before, used his intimate knowledge of the plantation's drainage ditches to appear behind the soldiers like a ghost. His shotgun spoke death at close range before he vanished again into the maze of cotton rows, leaving behind confusion and terror. The transformation in the young man was remarkable. The laughing field hand had become a deadly guerrilla fighter, his every movement calculated to inflict maximum damage while minimizing his own exposure. Old Benjamin, a man in his 70s who had never held a weapon in anger, turned his blacksmith's hammer into an instrument of war. When a soldier sought shelter in his forge, Benjamin emerged from the shadows like an avenging angel, his hammer crushing the man's skull with a single blow. The old man's strength, built through decades of working iron, proved more than adequate for the grim work of war. And through it all, Ezekiel's ancient rifle continued its deadly work from the chapel tower. Shot after methodical shot, each one carefully aimed, each one finding its mark. The weapon that everyone had mocked was proving to be the most effective firearm on the battlefield, its long range and devastating power giving the defenders a crucial advantage. The psychological effect on the attacking soldiers was devastating. They had come expecting to face frightened, unarmed slaves, but instead found themselves fighting a coordinated defense that seemed to anticipate their every move. The plantation that should have been an easy target had become a fortress, and the men they had dismissed as property were proving to be deadly adversaries. Colonel Hayes watched his carefully planned assault disintegrate into a nightmare of confusion and death. Half his men were down, and the others were pinned down by accurate fire from positions they couldn't even see. This wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter, and he was on the wrong end of it. "Fall back!" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Fall back to the tree line!" But falling back meant exposing themselves to Ezekiel's rifle, and the old marksman made them pay for every yard of retreat. His shots followed the fleeing soldiers like the voice of judgment, dropping them one by one as they tried to reach safety. The heavy bullets seemed to seek out their targets with supernatural accuracy, finding gaps in cover that should have provided protection. The retreat became a rout as discipline finally broke down completely. Soldiers who had faced Confederate charges at Gettysburg fled in panic from an enemy they couldn't see or understand. The psychological warfare that Ezekiel had learned from his grandfather was proving as effective as his marksmanship, breaking the will of professional killers who had thought themselves invincible. By the time the surviving soldiers reached the tree line, only 8 of the original 20 remained. They huddled behind the massive oak trees, their faces pale with shock and terror. These were men who had survived the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, but they had never faced anything like this. "Colonel," one of them said, his voice shaking with barely controlled panic, "we need to get out of here. This ain't natural. No man can shoot like that." Hayes looked back at the plantation, where smoke was rising from a dozen different positions. In the chapel tower, he could see the silhouette of the marksman who had destroyed his force, still calmly reloading his ancient weapon. The old rifle that should have been a museum piece had just rewritten the rules of warfare. "Who is he?" Hayes whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. "Who is that man?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Thomas, the blacksmith who had brought the warning the night before, stepped out from behind a tree with an old rifle in his hands. He had been waiting in the woods, ready to cut off any retreat, his position carefully coordinated with Ezekiel's overall defensive plan. "His name is Ezekiel," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of history. "And that rifle belonged to his grandfather, who fought slave catchers before you were born. It belonged to his great-grandfather, who helped build the Underground Railroad. You're not just fighting one man, Colonel. You're fighting 3 generations of men who refuse to bow down." Hayes looked around at his remaining soldiers, then back at the plantation where the defenders were already emerging from their positions, moving with the confidence of men who had just discovered their own power. The psychological transformation was complete. The enslaved had become the liberators, and the hunters had become the hunted. "This isn't over," Hayes said, but his voice lacked conviction. The words rang hollow in the morning air, the desperate bluster of a man who had just watched his world turned upside down. "Yes, it is," Thomas replied, his rifle trained on the colonel's chest. "It's been over since the moment you decided to hunt free men with an old rifle and the will to use it." As the sun climbed higher, painting the battlefield in shades of gold and red, the surviving soldiers began their long retreat. Behind them, the plantation had been transformed from a place of bondage into a symbol of resistance, its very air crackling with the electricity of newfound freedom. Ezekiel climbed down from the chapel tower, his ancient rifle cradled in his arms like a sleeping child. The weapon that everyone had mocked had just written one of the most incredible chapters in the history of the fight for freedom. His weathered face showed no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of a job well done and the knowledge that this was just the beginning. The transformation in the community was immediate and profound. Men who had spent their lives with their eyes cast down now walked with their heads held high. Women who had whispered in fear now spoke with voices of steel. Children who had never known anything but subjugation suddenly understood that their parents were not property but warriors. Marcus approached him, his face filled with a mixture of awe and newfound understanding. The young man had been transformed by the battle, his boyish features now bearing the hard lines of someone who had looked death in the face and emerged victorious. "Ezekiel, what happens now? Word of this will spread. They'll send armies." The old marksman looked out at the faces surrounding him, faces that had been marked by decades of oppression, but now glowed with the inner fire of people who had discovered their own power. The psychological chains that had bound them for generations had been shattered as completely as the bodies of their former oppressors. "Let them come," Ezekiel said, his weathered hand stroking the stock of his grandfather's rifle. "This old weapon has been waiting 50 years to remind the world that some things are worth fighting for, and now it has an army to back it up." The plantation yard was littered with the weapons of the fallen soldiers, modern Spencer rifles, Colt revolvers, and enough ammunition to outfit a small army. But more importantly, it was filled with men who had learned that they were not victims but warriors, that they were not property but human beings, with the power to determine their own destiny. Sarah approached with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Ezekiel, my grandson, he's going to grow up free. Because of what you did here today, he's going to grow up free." The old marksman nodded, understanding the weight of what she was saying. For the first time in generations, children would be born into this community who would never know the taste of chains, who would never have to bow their heads to men who claimed to own them. "Not because of what I did," Ezekiel corrected gently, "because of what we all did. This rifle may have spoken first, but it was your courage that gave it a voice." As the morning wore on, riders began arriving from neighboring plantations. Word of the battle had spread with lightning speed, carried by the same underground network that had sustained the resistance for decades. But now the messages were different. Instead of warnings about slave catchers, they carried news of uprisings, of other communities that had decided to follow Ezekiel's example. The Johnson plantation had risen in revolt, its enslaved population overwhelming their overseers and declaring themselves free. The Williams place had followed suit, with old hunting rifles and farm tools, proving more than adequate against men who had never expected real resistance. The spark that Ezekiel had lit was spreading like wildfire across the Mississippi Delta, igniting a conflagration that would reshape the entire region. By noon, nearly 200 armed men had gathered at the plantation, their faces bearing the grim determination of people who had finally decided to take their fate into their own hands. They came carrying whatever weapons they could find, ancient muskets, hunting rifles, even crossbows and spears fashioned from farm tools. But they also carried something more powerful than any weapon, the unshakable conviction that they were fighting for something worth dying for. Ezekiel stood before this impromptu army, his rifle resting against his shoulder like a staff of office. The weapon that had seemed so antiquated just days before now appeared to pulse with an inner fire, its every surface speaking of deadly competence and righteous purpose. "Brothers," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "today we proved that freedom is not something to be granted by others. It's something we take for ourselves, with our own hands and our own courage." The cheer that went up from the crowd could be heard for miles, a sound that struck terror into the hearts of plantation owners throughout the region. It was the sound of chains breaking, of a people who had finally remembered that they were human beings with the right to determine their own destiny. "They'll send armies against us," Ezekiel continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "They'll bring cannons and cavalry and all the instruments of war that money can buy. But they can't buy what we have, the knowledge that we're fighting for our children's future, for the right to live as free men and women." He raised the ancient rifle above his head, its weathered surfaces catching the sunlight like a beacon. "This rifle has been waiting 50 years for this moment. It's seen 3 generations of my family fight and die for freedom. Today, it speaks for all of us." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Men who had never dared to dream of resistance now shouted their defiance to the sky. Women who had lived their entire lives in fear now sang songs of liberation. Children who had been born into bondage now danced with the joy of those who had glimpsed a different future. But even as they celebrated, Ezekiel's mind was already turning to the challenges ahead. He knew that word of the uprising would reach the state capital within days, and that federal troops would be dispatched to crush the rebellion. The old rifle had won them a battle, but the war was just beginning. "Marcus," he said quietly, drawing the young man aside, "I need you to organize scouting parties. We need to know what's coming and when. This victory means nothing if we're not prepared for what comes next." Marcus nodded, his face serious with the weight of responsibility. The transformation in him was remarkable. The laughing field hand had become a military commander, his every movement speaking of newfound purpose and determination. As the day wore on, the plantation continued to transform. What had been a symbol of oppression became a fortress of freedom. Its buildings converted into defensive positions, and its fields turned into training grounds. The ancient rifle that had started it all was carefully cleaned and prepared for the battles to come, its voice ready to speak again when the moment demanded it. The sun was setting over the Mississippi Delta, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed to mirror the fire burning in the hearts of the newly free. In the distance, smoke columns rose from a dozen other plantations where the spark of rebellion had taken hold, spreading like wildfire across a landscape that had known only oppression for generations. Ezekiel stood on the porch of what had once been the overseer's house, his rifle cradled in his arms as he watched the sun disappear behind the cotton fields. The weapon that everyone had mocked had become a symbol of resistance, proof that freedom was not something to be granted, but something to be taken by those brave enough to fight for it. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, joining him on the porch with a cup of coffee. Real coffee, liberated from the plantation house along with everything else that had once belonged to their oppressors. "I'm thinking about my grandfather," Ezekiel replied, his voice soft with memory. "About how he always said that this rifle would know when its time had come. I think he'd be proud of what it accomplished today." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of what he was saying. "And what about tomorrow? What happens when they come with armies?" Ezekiel's weathered hands tightened on the rifle, feeling the smooth wood that had been shaped by 3 generations of his family. "Tomorrow we teach them that some weapons become more dangerous with age, and some men become legends not because of what they were given, but because of what they chose to do with it." The battle was over, but the legend was just beginning. In the years that followed, the story of Ezekiel and his 50-year-old rifle would spread throughout the South and beyond, inspiring other enslaved people to stand up and fight back. The weapon that everyone had laughed at had become a symbol of resistance, proof that courage, skill, and an unbreakable will to be free could overcome any odds, defeat any enemy, and transform any weapon, no matter how old or mocked, into an instrument of liberation. The mist was lifting from the cotton fields, and with it, the old world was passing away. In its place stood something new, a community of free men and women who had learned that their chains existed only as long as they chose to wear them, Ezekiel's rifle was silent now, but its voice would echo through history, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapons are not the newest or the most advanced, but the ones wielded by people who have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the old marksman allowed himself a small smile. The weapon that had been dismissed as a relic had just reminded the world that something, like freedom, like dignity, like the unbreakable human spirit, never become obsolete. The legend of Ezekiel and his ancient rifle had begun, and it would burn bright in the hearts of free people for generations to come. Years later, when historians tried to piece together the events at Riverside Plantation, they would struggle to separate fact from legend. Some claimed that Ezekiel had killed 20 men in 4 days. Others insisted it was 30. A few swore it was more. But the numbers didn't matter. What mattered was that a man everyone had dismissed as harmless had proven that freedom was not something to be granted by others, but something to be claimed by those brave enough to fight for it. The rifle still exists, passed down through generations of Ezekiel's family. It hangs now in a place of honor, its weathered stock and rust-spotted barrel telling a story that transcends the simple mechanics of powder and lead. It's a story about the power of underestimation, about the danger of judging a weapon, or a man, by its appearance. It's a reminder that sometimes the most devastating force on any battlefield is not the newest technology or the largest army, but the quiet determination of someone who has decided that enough is enough. The uprising that began at Riverside Plantation spread throughout the Mississippi Delta and beyond, inspiring similar revolts across the South. Federal troops were eventually dispatched to restore order, but the psychological damage had been done. The myth of the docile, grateful slave had been shattered forever, replaced by the reality of human beings who would fight and die for their freedom. Ezekiel himself disappeared into legend, some say retreating into the swamplands, where he continued to fight a guerrilla war against the forces of oppression. Others claim he made his way north, where his skills as a marksman were put to use in the service of the Union Army. But wherever he went, he carried with him the ancient rifle that had started a revolution. If this incredible story of courage and determination moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that no matter how old, how mocked, or how forgotten they might feel, they still have the power to change the world. Because sometimes, the most powerful weapons are the ones everyone overlooks, until the moment they speak. What's your favorite underdog story? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to check out our other incredible tales of courage against impossible odds.